Yo, yo.
Hey Roman.
Um, so I hear you were just in Mexico at some sort of psychedelic conference.
Yeah, it was I would say more of like a colloquium was the word um, of psychedelic researchers, like non-clinical researchers, psychedelic humanities people down in Sayulita, which is like a beach town just north of Puerto Vallarta, and it was fun. But the last day really was not so fun because I got hit with some intense food poisoning, one too many food truck tacos. But other than that, yeah, it was a lot of fun to get to hang out with other scholars, whether, coming out of philosophy or sociology or poetry, literature, to talk about these substances and these experiences. Yeah, it was enriching for sure.
Was there any sort of novel angle being taken, or was it sort of a rehashing of the therapeutic benefits of psilocybin and.
Mm. No, I would say this was more so looking at these other frames outside of the medical model, let's say, and the therapeutic mental health framing that a lot of the psychedelic renaissance usually gets um, understood in terms of. So this was more looking at like ceremonial uses, indigenous uses, um, and also just approaching psychedelics. I think most of the people present at this colloquium approach psychedelics either from a spiritual or religious shamanic point of view, let's say, or from a cognitive liberty point of view, that this is, a matter of consciousness expansion, transformation, of people who are, more or less well. I mean, we're all damaged goods to some extent, but, yeah, looking at this outside the frame of just a mental health treatment for depression, trauma, or PTSD or what have you. Not that there's anything wrong with that frame, but there's so many other frames.
Like a direct portal to the other side?
Yeah, esoteric and occult frames I think are especially interesting. Yeah.
Was there any psychedelic use happening at the colloquium, or
Not really. I mean, you know, things in Mexico are certainly looser. It's amazing what you can get at the pharmacy in Mexico.
like
It's
what?
just over the counter. Ketamine, I mean, veterinarian grade or veterinary grade ketamine is available just over the counter. Um, I didn't try any of that, but they're selling peyote and um, turns out the cannabis sucked there. It was really bad.
Really? Well,
Yeah,
California, it's hard to match up.
I know. I'm a little spoiled.
Ketamine, I tried once when they were running a bunch of clinical trials over here. You could sign up and do it at a doctor's office. And it was a compelling experience, but I found that afterwards I felt heavy and there was none of that post psychedelic afterglow, that sparkle, that sense that you're taking some of this with you. There was a feeling that I've just gone through something that was taxing on my body. So regardless of the momentary heights, it wasn't something I would go back to. Um,
I don't even consider ketamine a psychedelic, really. Um, and that's not a uncommon thing to say. It's more, I mean, it's a dissociative, right? And it seems to spur neurogenesis, and so I can see how it might help with depression, but it's not, I've had one or two intense experiences with it, and it's not really a space I'm especially in a rush to try to go back to try again. Yeah, it's less interesting to me.
yeah, it's what I imagined heroin feels like.
Hmm.
That's it matched up with
I
my
hope heroin's more enjoyable actually and pleasurable because I don't get pleasure out of ketamine.
okay.
I've never tried heroin, but it seems that people uh, have some kind of orgiastic, you know, deeply pleasurable experience, which ketamine to me is not really, it doesn't have a positive or a negative valence for me, really. It was just sort of weird.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Mm. Is there a particular quandary, philosophical, scientific, or otherwise, that's capturing you these days more than any other?
Hmm. I mean, the more I think back, comparing what I'm interested in now to what I have been interested in for 20 years or so as a like thinking adult, um, I've always been thinking about the same few questions, like what is the human being, what is God, and what is the universe?
Mhm.
And so I'm always kind of um, weaving into and out of those three main topics. Um, but I guess uh, you know, trying to understand our moment um, politically, geopolitically, is definitely on my mind right now, and finding ways as um, a philosopher and someone whose content is mostly in the conceptual, theoretical plane, finding ways to speak to geopolitical um, conflicts, the Israel-Palestine thing, or Ukraine still at war, and all these questions where um, I often find when I hear intellectuals or um, philosophers, scholars speak outside of their domain of specialization on some political issue, uh, I'm often surprised by the perspectives that they hold, and I wonder about how my own statements about these political issues is received by those um, who appreciate my political or my philosophical thought, but might be surprised by what I believe politically. And so I don't know. I guess I'm most recently really stewing in um, that interface, like how we are to show up as political animals when we also have ideals and ideas that, while relevant to our everyday lives and these power struggles, that relevance might not be as immediately obvious. And so I myself have to make the translation between philosophy and ideas and the allegiances that we form and the sides that we take and the real life struggles that we engage in. It's difficult and it's confusing, I admit.
Yeah. It might be easier as a philosopher to admit that war is sometimes necessary than it is in a real life situation to signal that you're okay with, murder on a large scale in a particular circumstance. Uh,
Right.
Is there a, I mean, yeah, we don't necessarily have to put this out there if you don't want to, but is there a political belief that you think would, or yeah, just a perspective on what's going on right now that would be particularly surprising to someone who's only followed your speculations on, those larger questions?
Um, well, I mean, I don't know how surprising it would be since I do from time to time mouth off about politics on social media. Um, yeah, I don't know. I really don't like being construed as like a middle of the ground kind of centrist person. But I also don't like being pigeonholed as left wing. I don't usually get referred to as conservative or right wing, but I do have some opinions that would be more, I mean, considered by some to be more conservative, I guess. I think abortion should be legal, but I don't think abortion is a good thing to do. It should be avoided if possible. Um, that might be surprising for people, you know, to hear. And I think really it's only surprising among like activists because most people are probably the average American or um, the average, yeah, person probably has similar views about, ideally avoiding having to have an abortion,
Yeah.
even if the polarized picture the media presents to us is that everyone's either on, you know, one extreme side. or the other. Um, I also think Israel has a right to exist, even though I don't think Israel has a right to systematically dehumanize millions of Palestinians. And so I often, in that issue, in that conflict, find myself making enemies on both sides.
Mm.
Yeah. But I don't know if any of that's particularly surprising. Are you surprised by any of that?
No, I'm not surprised. Yeah, I find here in California, when you hear about the strict abortion laws being passed in other states,
Hmm.
there's a tendency to frame it as an anti-woman thing, like over there they're oppressing women, and there's sort of a disregard for the large numbers of women in those places that also feel that abortion should not be allowed. And I'm I tend toward the view that, if these are your elected representatives and they're saying that there shouldn't be abortion in this state and that you'll have to go to some other state, um, that's a right that you'd imagine some of those people that are lamenting it would protect if it were something happening in a foreign country where their sense that we need to protect people's right to live by their cultural norms was under threat. Um, but but that here, yeah, we just view it as a totally regressive, dehumanizing, horrific act of violence toward women. And yeah, I mean, I don't want to live anywhere where that freedom isn't available to women, but it's not shocking to me that there are places where people think that's a horrific uh, act. And so, yeah, that's even just that perspective tends to cause a bit of conflict in this part of the world. Just the
Yeah.
notion that um, this isn't as simple as fighting people that are stuck in the Stone Age or something like that. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, on an issue like, I mean, on so many issues, I feel like it's helpful to be able to differentiate different spheres of social life and social organization. Like, there's the law and the rights that individuals have, and then there's different communities of moral interpretation. And I think it's very easy when we're passionate about something to conflate morality and law.
mm,
They're not the same thing. And so I think for me, it's very easy to hold a position that abortion should be legal and that women should be the ones to decide up to a certain point, you know, mm, when when the fetus can survive outside the womb, maybe we should start to question if that's too far, that's too late in the game to have an abortion. I mean, it's always going to be some gray area, but up to a certain point, it's a woman's right to choose legally because that woman has individual rights, constitutional rights. But at the same time, that being the legal situation, morally, it's like, I think, if I were involved in a situation where a pregnancy occurred, I would want to take some responsibility for creating the conditions for a new soul to incarnate.
mm,
And, um, you know, ideally have thought about that before engaging, before having sex. And I think it's not evil or patriarchal or controlling of women for there to be a type of moral community and culture where we want to talk about the consequences of sex and that it's not just about you and that other person. I mean, you can use birth control, you can do these things, but that usually doesn't entirely eliminate the possibility of conceiving, you know? And so it's like sexual morality has evolved very quickly over the last, since the 60s. And there's all sorts, like that revolution had a reaction and then another counter revolution. And so like we've been oscillating between these extremes only for the last several decades. And I think how it all is going to shake out might not be as revolutionary as the radicals want, and it might not be as reactionary as the conservatives want. but we do need to have a different kind of conversation about sexual morality, I think, if we're going to heal this rift. But maybe we can't heal it. Maybe we just need to let the states have their differences on this subject.
Hmm.
And I know that, for women who happen to live in the South, let's say, or other conservative states, and are harmed as a result of overly um, strict abortion laws, you know, that's a terrible situation. But at the same time, like, there's just, morally speaking, there's no one right answer to this. I think legally speaking, we can compromise and protect the rights of everyone involved. And like, once a fetus can live outside the womb,
Hmm.
that fetus, I would say, is an individual and has its rights, and so, like, there's always gray area here because we're imposing a legal definition of an individual on a biological reality that's um, doesn't have these sharp lines and distinctions that law would require.
Hmm.
um,
Yeah, in my mind, the idea that as a woman, you'd have to move out of your state if you wanted an abortion. Um, I know that presents a larger inconvenience than it might sound like at a first glance. People have jobs they can't just disappear from. And I'm not an expert on this topic, but I've heard, are there situations in which if you're caught in the process of leaving your state to go get an abortion, you can be prosecuted?
States would prosecute you for trying to cross state lines to get an abortion because it would still be considered murder, right? And so, yeah,
That's where it does cross into that Handmaid's Tale
yeah.
vibe.
Oh yeah, that is patriarchy.
That's
And
scary. That feels scary. Whereas
oppression of women. Yeah.
it seems like if they just drew that back a bit, if it stopped at, hey, we have voted and we don't want this procedure to happen within these state lines, you're
Mhm.
going to have to drive a few hours and do it elsewhere. It seems like you'd court so much less conflict and anger as a result. But I guess the whole reason they don't want it to happen within their state lines is they do believe it's full blown murder, and you should expect the full gamut of legal reaction to that as a result.
Mhm.
It's a tricky thing. Um, I've started reading Faust recently.
Nice.
I'd never approached Goethe before. I'd opened books before and felt like it wasn't particularly accessible. I don't know if it's this translation I have, the Matthew Bell, the Essential Goethe, um, but I'm finding it wonderful. I've always felt about Goethe, he's like one of these looming geniuses like Shakespeare that is just this wellspring of genius and creativity poetically and philosophically, and I'm sure he did science as well. Um, but I'm having a similar experience to opening something like Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, where, of course, you're getting a translation, but the accessibility and the applicability of the wisdom and the timelessness of the perspective hits home instantly. And, you know, it's in a way comforting, to have a character like Faust, who I'm sure is a reflection of Goethe himself in certain ways,
Mhm.
struggling with this feeling of the opening to the other side, those spiritual ecstasies that felt like they were ushering him into some new era. To the feeling that portal keeps closing and the frustration of being returned to like the uncertainty and discomfort of human life, and just getting angry about it, and this feeling of in-betweenness where he's talking about how he feels like he's he's old enough that the youthful hope that he had that everything would be all right is gone, but he's not old enough that his passions have died down, and he's tormented by these desires and these petty wants of fame and reputation, but he can't get rid of them. And it's just always nice to be reminded that even these monumental historical figures were just pushing through the shit like the rest of us. And I've only just gotten to the bit where his dialogue with Mephistopheles begins, and he's being tempted with this deal. And it sounds like the deal is something like, he's going to have this little devil giving him whatever powers and pleasures he wants. And as long as he doesn't cling too hard to any of them, he can have them. But at whatever point he starts begging the devil to, no, don't take me to the next moment. It's just too good here, that then it'll switch and now he'll be the slave rather than the master.
Mhm.
Um, have you, I mean, you've read Faust, I'm sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Is Goethe, um, I don't know much about Goethe. He always comes up in Jung and Nietzsche, but what yeah, what stands out about him to you as a thinker and an artist? Has he been important to you?
Certainly has been important. He's such a balanced human being. I mean, yeah, he's in the shit, like struggling through existence as a finite creature like the rest of us, but um, he's a poet and so sensitive to the interior subjective dimension of life, but he's also a scientist who is so sensitive to the objective movement of plant life and animal life and weather and granite. I mean, he's studying everything around him and is so sensitive to its objectivity. And he's studying all of these passions and emotions and ideas within himself, and he's so sensitive to their contours, and he sees the way that, doing justice to both and their differences, the way that the subjective and the objective unite, and that it's the human being's role to unite them. And I mean, Faust is his attempt to depict the situation of, I mean, it's timeless in a way, but it's also a very modern story of the, you know, philosopher, scientist, priest, who the Renaissance man who wants to know everything there is to know, and who also wants to be in relationship to that which can't be known, like Gretchen. And the role of the feminine in that story is also part of the tragedy, and the this paradox of desire, where if you clutch what you love, you strangle it, and that you have to allow what you love to be free, is a deeply human struggle. But I think what Goethe is trying to depict in this transition into what we call modernity is that it's also, you know, it's the human being's struggle with God, but it's a more inward form of that struggle than the medieval and the ancient world was used to, where God was something else, somewhere else, and other. I think in the modern period, and that Goethe and the whole German Romantic movement, even though Goethe reacts to some aspects of Romanticism, he's still part of the Romantic movement. It's 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 an incarnational process process that's happening, where that Goethe is so exemplary of, where the God man relationship is becoming it's becoming impossible to distinguish the two anymore, which puts a lot of pressure on the human being. And there's the risk of ego inflation, right? And this is all in Faust, but there's also just the fact that this is what is happening in modern culture, that the human being is taking up and waking up to this divine power. And I feel like Goethe remains this beacon, this a lighthouse figure in a way, to help guide us in this evolution of consciousness that we're engaged in. He's so ahead of his time in a way, but also yet so, as I said, balanced, that he was able to be in his time very effectively. he wasn't just a poet and a scientist. I forgot to mention that he was a statesman. Like he's working for the Duke of Weimar and engaging in diplomacy and statecraft, you know. And so there's nothing human that Goethe did not become at least proficient in, if not a genius in, right? So he's quite remarkable.
Do you think he would have been surprised by any of Whitehead's insights, or do you think it all would have lined up with his own intuitive sense of the world?
Hmm. No, I don't think he would have been surprised. I mean, they're both Neoplatonists. Whitehead's certainly more mathematical. Um, Sometimes I think people are a little bit too quick to say that Goethe was anti-mathematical, but he's really just he wishes I mean he relents or laments, I should say, that he wasn't better at math, and um, he says in his color theory, he wishes that he could have gotten some mathematicians to help him work out um, the geometry of his alternative theory of color, alternative to Newton's theory, because he did think that there was a geometrical side to it. He just wasn't proficient enough in that mode of thought to do it himself.
Can you go
Uh,
into the theory of color a little bit? Because I've heard that associated with him, but I don't understand what it means.
yeah, he wrote the Farbenlehre, the study of colors, and engaged in a series of experiments with prisms and created these boxes with glass panels in them and whatnot to see the difference between, what creates blue and yellow as colors, Goethe would say, and it's related to our experience of the sky. That we see, like, he answers the question, why is the sky blue? By saying, well, blue is the color you get when light shines into darkness through a medium, whereas yellow is the color you get where light shines um, out of darkness uh, towards your eye through a medium. And so you can think of like when the sun is setting and the sky around it turns yellow, that's because light is shining out of darkness into our eyes. Whereas when we look up at the blue sky, light is reflecting, off the earth from the sun, going back out into the darkness, and so it looks blue. And Goethe would say that there's actually a emotional, qualitative sense that we get from our experience of blue that like pulls us out into it as if we're just expanding out into space, whereas yellow feels more like it's coming into us and we're like retracting from it. Um,
And I
and
think there have been studies that showed that blue widened the network of creative associations for like writers and such that were in a room that was blue as opposed to red, which was heightening their, sense of alarm.
right, yeah, yeah, colors have these emotional tones to them. Um, and so Goethe wanted to do justice to this aspect of color, which he felt in Newton's color theory, where the color, so there, in Newton's view, there's white light, and what a prism does is it breaks up light into its components. And Newton thought that each color was a different shaped particle, and he had an account of light in terms of the of color as the diverse refrangibility, he would say, of white light, right? The different angles at which the prism splits light. It's like filtering out the seven colors that Newton would say makes up white light. And from Goethe's point of view, that's all wrong. That's a contrived um, model where Newton comes in with a preconceived geometrical hypothesis, which he then forces upon the phenomena, which is to say, Newton develops this, what he called the crucial experiment, where he's in a dark room and he has a pinhole of light coming through the window. And then he's got two prisms erected at some distance, exactly the right distance from one another. So this little beam of light comes through the pinhole, hits the first prism, and is refracted into another beam that goes into the second prism. And they're both angled just right. And then on the wall is projected this perfect seven color spectrum that Newton would use geometry to measure, right? And from Goethe's point of view, this is like taking nature and twisting its arm and torturing it until it produces the phenomenon that you want it to produce to conform your theory.
So
Whereas what
he probably disagree with a lot of the methods of modern science then.
absolutely, yeah, it's a Goethean science is a totally different form, totally different way of relating to phenomena. So what Goethe does is instead of this one experiment that's very contrived, um, Goethe develops as many experiments as he can muster. He wants to see the phenomenon of color and the phenomena of color from as many different perspectives as possible, right? And so what he ends up discovering by looking at the full spectrum, as it were, of color phenomena, um, is that color is really a mixture of light and dark. Color only appears at the edges where light and dark meet each other. And he proves this through a whole variety of experiments, as I said. And so, whereas darkness in Newton is kind of just like the absence of light, in Goethe, darkness becomes a positive principle in its own right. And color is a function of in some sense, the struggle between darkness and light to reconcile themselves to one another. And so color becomes a drama displayed before us of, um, in some sense, the darkness of the earth and the light of the sun um, trying to merge with each other despite their differences. And it, it, it creates a much more, there's more room for our own subjectivity in Goethe's account of color as well, because in a similar way that there's this polarity between dark and light, um, to give rise to the possibility of color. In our actual experience of color, Goethe would say that the eyes are always meeting the colors in our environment with the opposite, with the polar opposite or complementary color. And you can see this quite easily if you just stare at green, like a green screen or a green piece of paper for 30 seconds, and then look at something white, you'll see red. And that's because your eyes had been struggling to meet the green with their own inner redness. And when you look at a neutral surface, all of a sudden you see what your eyes had been pushing out while looking at the green. You see red. Um, you do this with yellow and purple and stuff also. And so it's it's a theory of polarities, and it's an attempt to overcome this very abstract Newtonian approach to color as just a like mechanistic splitting up of what he called white light. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more to say about it, but that's the basic picture.
So real quick to go back to his account of yellow, what was that description of what produces yellow?
So yellow is when you have light coming in from behind a medium towards the eye, right? It produces yellow, he would say, whereas blue is a function of light going out towards dark space. And so it's just a function of the direction of the light in relation to the eye through a medium. And so the medium in this case is the atmosphere. And he built this box with glass windows in the top of it, and the top could open and close. And when he closed the box and looked through the glass panes, he saw blue if there was light in the room outside of him. And if he opened the box, the glass planes would turn yellow, right? If the light was behind them and wasn't going into the darkness, but was just coming through into his eyes. And so he thought that this was an experimental analog of our experience of the sky. And so, you know, blue and yellow just become a function of how the eye sees the vector of light through space, right?
Would he
Whether it's
consider the peel of a banana another instantiation of this law somehow?
so that would be an example of what he would call chemical colors, and there's physiological colors, physical colors, chemical colors, and so color can manifest for different reasons. There are, I mean, he has a whole chapter in his book on the color theory about the mixing of paints and pigments to produce different colored paints, and he has a whole section on color in the biological world and in the plant and animal world. And it's a complexification of the laws of polarity that I was just describing in the sky. And so, yeah, the same that like there would be a different reason that the banana is yellow than that the sky is yellow. Yeah.
On the uses of history for life.
Mm.
Um, yeah, it's in Untimely Meditations, and he talks about how the idea of studying history like a science is a fairly new human invention, where we look back at these great figures of the past, Goethe being one of them, and rather than just wanting to see what was great about them and what can inspire us, we want to know everything about them. We want to know what made them human, their foibles. I saw a lecture on this, where we want to find out that Abraham Lincoln was austere, maybe just because he had wooden teeth that were very painful in his mouth, and thereby bring him down to earth a little bit, or focus on the fact that he married a much older woman, so he wouldn't have who had a lot of money, so he wouldn't. And that with this approach to history, where we're trying to demythologize it, in some ways we drain its vitality and make it less useful to us. And obviously Nietzsche was very uh pro-life in another sense, in that he kind of valued or devalued things based on how they facilitated for a full experience right now. um and I guess you could look at earlier mythologies as histories that were meant only to serve life, right? I'm sure there was some human counterpart that the Greeks were drawing inspiration from in the construction of their gods.
Mm.
And it just, became irrelevant as to whether or not, yeah, they became non-human entities that just represented these great traits. And we in this country are definitely engaging with history right now, uh, in a way where anything that seems too ideal, we want to tear apart and look at all the warts
Yeah.
and be reminded that there's that things we consider great had terrible immoral motives behind them. Um, and Nietzsche described the sort of human being that approach to history gives rise to, as a kind of person whose inner life is very distinct from their outer life. And in his estimation, if these vital Greeks or Romans could come and see modern Europeans, they look at them slash us as walking encyclopedias of a sort, where we're bizarrely ill-suited to and alienated from our immediate surroundings, but we have this list of facts, in our mind that we can display at any moment. And I wonder if, in your experience as a scholar, really, who I'm sure in your world of academia, you have quite a bit of company, but it does seem like a less common occupation now, just given the attention span that it requires and all the things working against the average person being able to develop an attention span that would allow them to become a scholar. Um, do you keep tabs, or yeah, pay a sort of inner attention to knowledge that you feel is actively vitalizing you and improving your day-to-day experience? And do you ever feel over encumbered? Do you ever feel like you have accumulated a wealth of knowledge that there isn't a direct use for? Um, yeah, I guess that's
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, value in our moment in history is so often reduced to instrumental value and economic value, and value that has an immediate uh, payoff in terms of the goods and services it allows you, to acquire or have immediately at hand. And you know, in that sense, I think philosophy is completely and entirely useless. Like if philosophy is learning to die, right, then it really is. It's not only not going to help you with these more instrumental ends, it's going to actively hamper your ability to successfully acquire and meet the goals of modern life, in some sense. If those goals are to, make money and gain power and leave your mark on the world, I think a philosophical life is not necessarily going to contribute to that at all. Um, so there's a big battle going on, has been going on for decades, really, about the value of a humanities education, and a lot of funding has been shifted away from um, that side of universities and to STEM fields and um, business departments and law and these sorts of um, disciplines and trades that have a more immediate instrumental use value in our economy. And I think I have no problem just admitting that philosophy is useless. It's absolutely useless. And I think there's an important shock value in that.
You don't really believe it though.
Well, it's again, it's useless if all you're concerned about is um, acquiring material stuff and status.
Yeah, well, I guess my question might have been a little bit convoluted because I think philosophical knowledge would be precisely, I mean, the kind of knowledge that would give direct value to immediate experience because you're imbuing the natural world around you with a
If
sense
you
of
want your experience to be unsold, if you want, there are certain ideas that I find transformative that are not just like theoretical, but actually um, enrich me morally and deepen my appreciation for life, that are not necessarily the most scholarly ideas or the most easily philosophically defended ideas, but they actually, how they function in my life is they, well, for one thing, just my own meditation on them strengthens me, but also these ideals bring me into communities that also care about these ideals, and those communities become the people in my life that I love and that love me. And so um, there's something about, I mean, on some level, this is the function of religion, right? It brings you into community, and you share ideals that you feel help you deepen and cultivate insight into the nature of existence, but that also they bring you warmth, not just like insight, but you feel you feel held in community as a result of your devotion to these ideas. Um, and that, I think, is, that's part of what it means to lead a philosophical life for me. Like philosophy is not just a profession; it's a vocation. It's a calling that I responded to, and that it has led me down a path that's, I mean, I've been very lucky along the way that I can also support myself with it professionally, but that's not why I do it. And I think I've felt the gifts of committing to that way of life. Um, and I do believe, I feel drawn to share those gifts with others so that they might lead a similar life. Um, because I do think it's enriching for everyone, or could be. Um, but it's swimming upstream. I mean, it's swimming against the current to advocate for a philosophical life because it does seem so impractical. Because all these values I'm discussing, community and like strength in oneself and one's resolve to exist and to further the evolution of consciousness, which sounds highfalutin, but like that's um, it can seem very ephemeral and unreal to those who are committed more fully to the economic bottom line and the and you know there's also political struggles which people become very committed to and build their identities around, which I don't want to be dismissive of, but which I feel if they're not enriched by a deeper philosophical perspective and some contact with the eternal and get fully entrenched in just the temporal, I feel like those that form of political activism can actually become more destructive than beneficial. So yeah, to say philosophy is useless is not to say that I don't want to advocate for people to live a more philosophical life, but its use comes in less tangible ways, for sure.
Yeah, well, there's distinct realms of philosophy, and some of them, the practical value is immediately clear. Like, with Stoic philosophy, for instance, where you, if you read Seneca or Marcus Aurelius, they'll mention a very relatable feeling, like the sense that what you're doing, is tedious, and uh, you're wondering, why you should keep going. And then they'll paint some larger picture of all these different forms of life that get up and do their work each day so that we can partake in fruits together. And what good is your complaining? It actually serves no purpose at all. And once you uh, ingest that, you're able to then, continue with a little more enthusiasm. Um, and then there are other realms of philosophy that I go in and I fall in and out of love with. You know, where say you experience a moment of felt unity with the natural world around you, and there's a sense that you have an intuitive grasp of the simple laws that are governing the changing of the seasons and shapes and feelings. It all feels very um, intimate, and then that state passes, and there's this desire to reconnect to it and an inability to conjure that feeling at will. And I go looking for tools that could make it a more um that could bring that state under my control a little bit more, like my ability to find it. And I find these systems um by these brilliant systematic philosophical minds, and I get the sense that if I can internalize their system, that that will mean I get to stay there because I'll have this conceptual scaffolding to stabilize that state with. Um, and that may be true for some people, that can stabilize through a grasp of these systems. Um, I I guess I lose heart sometimes. I will be really trying to hold these ideas in mind, like, even say, the Whiteheadian idea of apprehension as like a transmission of feeling. Um, I feel like every time I approach the term or I approach any of his terms, a
Mhm.
sort of a different visualization comes to mind. I have a new impression of it. And at first, that's incredibly stimulating because I feel like there's something that's going to stabilize there. And it might just be a shortcoming of my own mind. But after reapproaching it many times and feeling like these terms are for me just evoking ever changing uh images about like the I can't I can't I can't quite grasp it. I just can't quite grasp it, and I end up feeling a bit lost and um maybe unfairly so wanting to say like, wait a minute, is this, why, like, shouldn't all these ideas always be making sure to like come back to the everyday struggles, and shouldn't isn't it the job of these philosophers to somehow make the practical, like, I think there's such thing as practical spiritual use. I don't think it's like, oh well, you're going to think philosophy is useless if you just want to make money and build physical structures. It's like, no, I want to feel at home in the world. Uh, and there's certainly overlap between the moments when I'm grappling with these systems, um, and when I'm feeling at home in the world. Because I guess at that moment I'm feeling it's worthwhile to try and situate myself properly. Um, but yeah, I mean, this is a very unoriginal feeling to have. I feel like many of the philosophers themselves at times will criticize one another, like Bertrand Russell just saying Hegel is utterly useless. And I know, we've talked about that, and that was sort of I don't know, a bit of snide British affect coming through that wasn't doing Hegel justice. And I don't think even Russell himself would, if his feet were held to the fire, say there's nothing valuable in Hegel or he was truly just out of his mind. Um, but yeah, sometimes I'm like, can't you just make it, just help me? I just need help. I want more direct help. And I can't and even I get these intimations of beauty from these systems, but then I can't translate them. And and I'll yeah, I'll dial into a talk between like you and Tim, and I'll at moments just I'll be very stimulated by trying to figure out what you guys are talking about. And then I have no, I can't find it. And I'm like, this can't, if they would just go back to, I don't know, just some simple reminder of like, here's the problem we're trying to solve here. Like here's, and and yeah, again, I mean, I'm not an academic. Uh, I'm not an academic, but yeah, I don't think, I think philosophy can make its practical applicability really clear if it wants to. And it just doesn't always seem to want to.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of two minds about this. When I think of Socrates, I think of philosophy as actually a a means of making the world strange and becoming a stranger to the world. Like Socrates is an example of philosophy and a philosopher who does not feel at home in his polis and who asks questions about the gods that are being worshipped at these different festivals and asks questions about justice and piety and knowledge that there are answers to in the context of Athenian culture, but that are merely verbal answers. And so he keeps asking, well, what does that mean? And so he's a stranger in his own time and place. And I think there's something about philosophy which, in that Socratic sense, is a response to not feeling at home. It's a response to feeling like you're a stranger and that existence is weird. You don't know how it works. You'd like to know, but all you have now are questions. And so, is the philosopher's role to give you the answers that bring you back home? I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, Socrates didn't have any answers. He just had questions, and he ultimately, I think, was trying to, as a teacher, get those who would engage with him um, to come up with their own, not only their own answers, but their own questions. Uh, and so, on some level, I feel like the philosopher's role is to wake people up from a false sense of security, or to wake people up from sleepwalking and thinking that they know what's going on here, um, and to actually like to when you begin the philosophical to live a philosophical life, you're stepping out of a comfortable sense of imagining you know what's going on into a very strange land where, yes, you start to see how wonderful and amazing everything is, but wonder and amazement and awe also have a terrifying side, because as soon as you step off the treadmill and look around, you realize you don't know who you are, you don't know what this is, and that's really destabilizing, and it pulls the ground right out from under your feet. So, if anything, I think getting stung by, you know, um, the Socratic way of responding to your existence and your experience, and he was often referred to as a gadfly, um, is is not bringing you home, making you feel more at home. It's actually doing the opposite. And I don't know if that means we need something else to bring us back home. I
Well, I
mean,
feel like you've described Whitehead's philosophy as putting the human being back in their proper place, like at home, not an alien. And I think the way you just described philosophy's uh, use for getting people out of that comfortable sense that they know what's going on. I think philosophers help people with that, but that many a philosopher is temperamentally the type that carries that scary sense of constant mystery with them. And like I know for one, I don't struggle so much with feeling too much at home or like everything makes too much sense. I really don't. I the mystery element. I mean, not to say that I can't fall into patterns of mundane behavior that start to drain some of that vibrancy from the whole thing, but um, it's not hard for me to access the sense that I have no idea who I am or what's going on, and and I think it is whenever you've been talking about Whitehead and you get to those moments where you say what he's trying to do is put us back at the center of this picture in a way that's dignified, and we're not just these accidental creatures meaninglessly thrown into an alien landscape. That's when I'm always reassured, that I need to be grasping this more. And yeah, when I'm Socrates is I of course understand the impact and the beauty of Plato's writing, but I don't that sort of deconstruction, that sense that like, oh, I'm going to show you that your sense that what justice is has no foundation. I don't feel like I need that personally, that I need to be like walked through how little I know. Whereas when I get to Whitehead not that this is what he says exactly, but I get to a sense that like, right, you can deconstruct something like the sense of justice logically, but because what really lies at the bottom of it is a feeling that is ultimately irreducible, that it's an intuition, it's has um and language should be helping to further and facilitate it, but not hope to ever find its foundation in any final way. Um, So I'm saying all this to say I think there's so many different facets to philosophy and so many different approaches that I don't feel comfortable with characterizing philosophy as not practically useful, but still worthwhile in this other way. I think the practical use is under advocated for. Um, and
Yeah.
and not stoicism has the reputation of, oh, this is the pragmatic, this is the everyday person's philosophy, but I think Whitehead could have that too. I think it all could have that.
Yeah, I hear all that, and that's, I really am of two minds about this. And I think as long as you share Whitehead's problem, then his solution could make you feel more at home in this universe. Um, I think a large part of the struggle is to come to share Whitehead's problem and his questions, and that what that would entail is, to be at least, if not expert in mathematical logic and capable of fully spelling out like the transformation which occurs in the early 20th century around our understanding of the foundations of mathematics. But like Whitehead's coming out of that situation where the very ground of logic was pulled out from under him, right? And he really thought with Russell that they could logically deduce the intelligible structure of mathematics, and it turns out they couldn't. And that is what leads Whitehead to construct this new metaphysics of feeling, where what we used to think of as, this a conceptual account as if it could be self-grounding, turns out no, what the basis of our experience and of existence is emotional. For a mathematical logician to end up there at the end of his life is um, should be surprising, right? So it's coming to share Whitehead's problem that allows us to understand that solution, not just as romantic regression, but as the fruit of rigorous logical reflection and a consequence of, what Gödel later proved, this incompleteness of our capacity to systematize. Like
Yeah.
there's an intrinsic incompleteness in um, logic that prevents us from ever finishing a consistent system. We can logically prove that, right? So it's this interesting paradox, but still, if you can share the surprise and understand the shock that this discovery um, was experienced as for these thinkers, then Whitehead's solution, I think, and the reason he goes through all of this, all these linguistic gymnastics, becomes more clear, I think, and then his scheme of categories can function more like a telescope and less like a maze um, of new words, right? So, but that's why I think, there are always going to be many systems. Stoicism has its metaphysics as well, and a rich sense of um, the cosmic logos, and the world soul, and like it's very practical, and it's about dealing with your you know psychological and emotional responses to life when things don't go your way, and whatnot. And there's a profoundly useful ethics um, and pragmatics to it, but it's also got metaphysics behind all of that that's just as rich and complicated.
Would you say it's more of an implied metaphysics though? Like that?
It's presented that way nowadays, but for the Stoics in the ancient world, it wasn't. It was fully part of why they lived the way that they did.
Okay.
I think it gets a little bit more secularized and stripped, just in the way that Western Buddhism does. It gets stripped of some of its mythic, metaphysical um, clothing, and it's not just clothing though. It's really at the core of it. Um, and I think it's great, like the modern or contemporary revival of Stoicism, and like I've seen some of Massimo Pigliucci's writing. He's a philosopher of science, but also draws on Stoicism. But the way it's presented is just so it's just so secularized and made sort of sterilized for a scientifically minded um, contemporary audience. Whereas I think Stoicism in its ancient context is quite enchanted and magical and full of a sense of the animacy of the non-human world.
Mhm.
Um, yeah,
There's a lot of mention of the gods, but there's also a lot of explicit direction to not occupy the mind with anything outside of its direct purview, or else you're going to be drawn into all sorts of traps.
right.
Um, and so that's why I've tended to feel like whatever metaphysics is there is more implied. But yeah, I think I just sort of expand and contract in relation to all of this stuff. I try to wrap my head around um, ever larger pieces of philosophical systematic thought. And when I exhaust that faculty, I contract back into, okay, like what are the things I need to do in a day that will stop me from descending into a dark place? And in those moments, yeah, I just need to be told to get into a cold bath and sit quietly for 10 minutes and not neglect my friendships and eat healthy and, don't overstimulate my mind. Um, and, there's something humbling and centering about that for me. Um, and then, something intimidating about the realms of abstraction. But I'm sure, when once I start feeling overconfident again, I'll take another crack. Um, yeah, I but I also wonder in terms of the practical value of philosophy, if the perceived value there is going to increase as more and more jobs get
Mm.
uh, outsourced to artificial intelligence. I mean, a couple weeks ago, the world of music had its chat GPT moment with I think at least one of the apps is called Udio. I forget what the other one's called, but very quickly you can create professional sounding music of any genre with custom lyrics, or you can have it create the lyrics and it'll just continuously generate new iterations. And there's so many video essays online right now about artificial intelligence. And I get not wanting to be too much of a pessimist, but when someone's saying, like, think of all of the music hiding inside of every person on earth that's now going to get to express itself because the tools have been democratized to such an extent. I'm like, well, they're not you're not making music.
Yeah,
It'd be one thing if it's like these incredible tools have come whereby, like, I could imagine a version of artificial intelligence aided music creation that would be something more like what you'd mentioned a long time ago, where it's the technology's sort of hidden, right? So maybe you're just in a room and you start humming your own melody, right? And you're like, oh, I'd like this, what I'm humming right now to be a trumpet. And now your hum sounds like a trumpet. And you're like, okay, save that. And now it's captured there. Like, okay, loop that. Something that's engaging the music that lies inside of people. But the idea that you're just going to ask this thing to create Swedish house music with singing happy birthday to your uncle, and that you've unleashed some incredible latent creativity in the human species, it's not an inspiring picture. um and I'm honestly surprised. Like, it's funny, like, I just got a new publishing deal as a songwriter, so I've been getting sent out to these sessions, and everyone's talking about it, but most people, like, they look at it, they watch one of those videos, and then they just don't want to think about it. And
yeah,
whereas I optimistic, I don't know how much longer this profession is viable. A few more years, especially like these companies are so ruthlessly profit driven. Um,
Well, the key for me is just going to be labeling. Like AI created content cannot be passed off as human created content. That needs to be legally codified, I think. But there will always be, just like there's such a market for organic foods, like there'll always be a market for human art, and it'll be more expensive and, more refined, hopefully, right? So it'll filter out. There's directions this can go where this technology does continue to ramp up, but we're actually still able to, because people do want, I don't think it's hard for people to detect, to feel, and desire the difference and maintaining the difference, even if there are plenty of people who will love to play with these toys and think of themselves as artists, even though it's an algorithm.
yeah. I mean, one thing going on now, so a big part of the music industry is pitch, right? So if you have some songwriters that are put into a session together and the artist isn't present, the publishing companies and the labels will be like, "Hey, we'll just write a song that could meet these criteria because here's what this or that artist is looking for." Um, and then, send it and we'll pitch it to the artist. And now, oh, and you used to have vocalists that were great at pitch, meaning that they could sell a song, right, with their emotion. And now, oftentimes, if you want to pitch a song to one of these artists, you after you've recorded the song, you can just make the vocal sound like the artist already and just pitch it to the label, and the label will be like, well, this sounds great. And there are songs that I know of, everyone's talking about them now. Artists have recently put out, big pop artists that are not them, that they received the pitch song and they were like, well, and they maybe even tried to recreate it, but they're like, this version sounds better, it's my likeness, just put it out. And there one semi encouraging development I'm seeing with the reception of this stuff online is that kids that are consuming this stuff seem now to pride themselves in their ability to discern what's AI and what's human. There's a
Yeah.
sense that they don't want to be duped. They don't want it to be this easy for you guys to just feed us shit. And that's encouraging, right? That and because what are they doing when they're trying to discern that difference? What are they training in themselves? Hopefully they're training an ability to figure out what it is that lets you know something's human, flaws and all. And um, artists like Grimes are doing a very interesting thing where she's letting anybody that wants to use her voice as an AI use it, has it sent to her. And now, whenever she releases a project, she releases the one she made and she releases the one that was AI generated. And she's, just interested in seeing which one does better. Of course, she has Elon Musk as her baby daddy. So she's not too worried about the financial repercussions of her AI likeness becoming more profitable than her. But yeah, I I don't know. I'm always grappling with how to approach music stuff in a way that isn't going to be spiritually draining. Like next week, I'm meeting with this woman at Cobalt who handles more of their hip hop stuff, and they're going to be sending me into some sessions with some like young rap kids at really just trying to make the music feel like it has more of a story to it, so there's like a narrative arc that a fan can connect to.
Mhm.
And I can get behind that if I feel like in the session I could actually inspire something in that kid to make him want to do more of that, and not just that he's going to require me to make him seem like he's about more than talking about money and how he doesn't trust girls, right? uh there's a sense that okay, there could be something psychologically compelling about like planting these seeds. Like, could I have some kind of positive impact here in the 3 years remaining that it's even a job? Um,
Yeah.
but it's all that to say that yeah, the philosophy, the idea that it doesn't have practical utility when none of us have these jobs anymore, and we're just figuring out how to occupy ourselves day to day at home and make it feel meaningful, you might see a giant uptick in the interest in philosophy.
I appreciate that. I mean, it certainly sounds better to me if people got more into philosophy than was it Yuval Harari who said like we're going to need much better video games because all
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, philosophy would at least allow us to continue deepening our humanity. But, work is so important. Like labor, when it's not alienated labor, it's so it's essential for our humanness too, and so maybe we can get back to like farming and, like trying to create the perfect apple, and just really return to these less glamorous forms of work that, and I know there's machines to do all that too now, but if we do have this capacity to automate away so much of the jobs we don't want, like what are the jobs that would actually be fulfilling that we don't want to give away to the machines? Because yeah, philosophy is great, but I don't think we can really satisfy the full human life just with thinking. We have hands and legs too, like
I've just been recently, my son is about to turn 1, and I'll just take him outside, put him on the ground in front of a plant. And I'll just really watch what his eyes are doing. And he hasn't ever used any sort of technology that would shorten his attention span, so he can just stay fascinated by a flower for a long time. And I'm sure every parent thinks the kid's going to stay that way, and then the world, comes in and has its way to whatever degree you allow it to. But I I guess it gives me hope that, when I have an hour or something like in the garden with this pure being, I'm like, if I really need to be working on my ability to enjoy this and stay focused on that flower for as long as he is. Because yeah, I could imagine in, 10 years or something, how to make practical use of our day-to-day energy is going to be a more difficult question perhaps for some of us. And I want to be able to meet, by the time my son is a more conscious creature, I want to be able to meet him. I don't want to have, to belong to this other world that then I don't want to initiate him into, but have no choice but to because of what I've become. Um, I have to go here in a minute, but I just, when you said we're going to need much better video games, um, I had this idea a long time ago, and it's not totally hashed out, but the idea of a philosophical video game in which you, as your character comes into contact with different thinkers, the way the world around him appears changes, and that there's these sorts of visual representations of what, say, imbibing a Whiteheadian worldview looks like, and then when you mix it with like now your character reads Faust and now he perceives the characters around him now look a little different, or different elements of them shine out to him. There are possibilities in the new landscape that
yeah,
could be exciting.
gamifying the history of philosophy would definitely give it more mass appeal. Like instead of writing yet another history of philosophy, you can actually be a character moving through history, engaging with these thinkers in the changing social and ecological scenes in which those schools of thought arose. I mean, that would be quite fascinating.
I think you could sell your likeness to be the protagonist.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah. I mean, and using a different LLM, for each philosopher trained on their work, you could really um, make that a lot of fun. Yeah.
Well, I think we've stumbled upon our collaborative large scale project.
Yeah, it's gonna need a good soundtrack too. Yeah.
I'll get on Udio now and start generating us 1,000 options for the intro.
Yeah.
Oh,
Just let's find a VC and get to work on this.
oh yeah. Okay, real quick. So I'm gonna stop the recording.